Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to connect PingFederate to ZSLogin for SAML and SCIM user provisioning so that administrators can SSO from a PingFederate environment into ZSLogin. Now, I just recently did a video that showed how to configure the ZIA connector in PingFederate, and in that video I provided a little bit more education and context around PingFederate than I'm going to in this video. So if there's anything I skip over too quickly or you're confused, maybe take a look at the ZIA connector video I recently did. I'll include a link in the description. And that should help provide a little bit more context. In this video, I intend to go as quickly as possible just to get to the meat of the actual configuration required between PingFederate and ZSLogin. Now, in my environment here, I already have a connection to a data store and an authentication policy. Just quickly, the data store, I added some additional groups and users since the last video. In this video, we're going to leverage these two groups, ZSLogin groups and ZSLogin users. And ZSLogin users will hold a list of users that will be provisioned over to ZSLogin. And ZSLogin groups will hold a list of groups that will be provisioned over to ZSLogin. In our case, we're just going to have one group that we're going to provision. In the users we provisioned, I'm already configured to provision this user.3 when things are fully configured, but I've also got this other user, user.4, which we'll add later. All right, so the first thing you want to do when setting up the integration is download the SCIM connector from pingidentity.com's website. So go under Resources, Software, Mobile App Downloads, go into the PingFederate section, go to the Add-ons tab. And originally I was hoping I'd be able to leverage the Zscaler Internet Access connector for this, but it didn't work. So I've been using the SCIM connector, and it does work. So download that SCIM connector. That'll download a zip file. And within that zip file, you'll extract this pfSCIM quick connection jar file. And that gets dropped into the PingFederate server default deployed directory. And if you just did that, you'll need to restart PingFederate in order for PingFederate to pick it up. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, actually I'll kind of walk through my configuration in ZSLogin currently. So I don't have a PingFederate connection, which we're going to add here as a secondary IDP in a second. Under the user list, the thing to look for is you don't see users with username user.3 or user.4, so those will come in via provisioning. And under user groups, we don't have a group called ZSLogin users, which you'll eventually see here as well. So we're going to create a secondary IDP, and on the PingFederate side, we're going to save ourselves a step and export some SAML metadata. And so that's found under System, Protocol Metadata, Metadata Export. And I'm going to choose to include metadata manually. So this will be a SAML 2.0 metadata file. Don't need to include anything in the attribute contract. I want to select the signing certificate so that it can be automatically uploaded via the metadata into ZSLogin. Next two steps we can skip over. We just need to get to the export button. We're exporting this file here. And on the ZSLogin side, we're going to give this a name, call it PingFederate. Choose the PingFederate identity vendor option. We're going to use this domain. I'll just enable it for now. And then we're going to upload that metadata file. And while we're here, I'll just go over and enable SCIM provisioning, generate a token. I will save this so we don't lose any of that. We'll be coming back to some of those settings here in a second. But ultimately, the ZSLogin side is configured. On the PingFederate side, we need to add a new SP connection. So I'm going to create a connection. I am going to use a template. In this case, we're going to use the SCIM connector. And the SCIM connector knows that it's used for provisioning, so outbound provisioning is already automatically selected, but we also need to choose Browser SSO in this case. And we get to the General Info tab. This first setting is specifying the entity ID of ZSLogin. And so we need to go over to ZSLogin and find that value, SP entity ID. Great. So paste that in. Rather than call it skim connector, I'm just going to call it ZSLogin. And normally I would set a base URL, but in this case, I'm going to skip it because we only need one value that we're going to copy in later. So that base URL doesn't help us very much. So next step here is setting up browser SSO. Then we'll set up the credential, which is just selecting the signing certificate. And then the last major step will be setting up provisioning. So under browser SSO, we're going to have to do a few more manual steps than we had to do in the video I just recorded around setting up the ZIA connector. Because again, the ZIA connector is familiar with the SSO configuration required to connect to ZIA, whereas the skim connector isn't aware of any sort of SSO configuration. So there's nothing templatized here for you. So we're going to use SP initiated SSO. And then under assertion creation, standard is fine. The attribute contract by default includes the SAML subject, or often within Zscaler we refer to this as the name ID attribute. So that's already defined. And here's where I link my authentication policy to this particular connection by selecting a policy contract. I'm going to select the subject policy contract, which just returns one attribute subject. And just to go over this again, this will be populated with the value of the username that the user enters in the login screen that PingFederate serves. So they'll enter a username and password, and the result of the authentication policy will be to populate this policy contract with that user's username value stored in the subject attribute. All right. I'm going to query a data store to look up a user based on that subject in order to retrieve the mail attribute, because ultimately we need an attribute in the format of mail for ZSLogin. So again, users will be entering a value like this, user.3, but we want to query the directory and pull out a value like this, user.3 add a domain. And again, that's the same domain we just chose when setting up the connection in ZSLogin. So I'm going to add attribute source. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Choose my directory, the base DN. All users are found under this base DN that we'll be using here. So that's great. But I do need to retrieve the mail attribute. And then this is how PingFederate will look up the user in the directory. So look up the user based on essentially what they entered into the login form and find a user object that has a UID value equal to that. All right, and so here's where we're populating the SAML assertion with attributes, in this case just one attribute, SAML subject, or again as we often refer to it as name ID. And we're going to abort the transaction there's an issue. All right, so we've completed the configuration of wiring up an authentication policy to this connection. And so the last step here is setting up protocol settings. Now in the ZIA video, I was able to skip over this step because this was already pre-configured. In our case, we need to tell PingFederate specifically what values to use. And so the assertion consumer service URL is this SP URL. So populate that, click add. The allowable SAML binding step is telling PingFederate which SAML bindings it'll support. ZSLogin only uses post, so I'll uncheck the other options so that we just receive post requests. Just moving forward here, clicking next, clicking done, and we've completed the configuration required to support SAML SSO from PingFederate to ZSLogin, minus just this one last related step, which is selecting the signing certificate. And so that's done, and then the next step is configuring outbound provisioning. Now, the configuration options for the skim connector are quite a bit different than the configuration options for the ZIA connector. It's a much more general purpose connector, But rest assured for ZSLogin, it's fairly simple. We basically just need to tell PingFederate the API URL to use for Skim and how to authenticate to that API. So we're going to authenticate using OAuth2 bearer token. And right here is where we'll paste in that value. So that's this here. So we've told PingFederate where to connect and how to authenticate to the Skim API. And so now we need to tell PingFederate how to find users within the directory. So we're going to define this provisioning channel. It doesn't matter what you call it. We're going to query that data store that I have. Nothing needs to change on this tab. So the source location is where we tell PingFederate where to find users. Again, we're going to find users under this branch in the directory, Zscaler users. And then the group DN for finding the users to provision, already sort of pre-populated here based on my browser cache. But it's this is the group DN for this object here, which again currently holds user.3. And then for the groups group DN, it's going to be the ZSLogin groups. And again, that corresponds to this object, which has just one member, this particular group called ZSLogin users. All right, so that's all we need to set there. On the attribute mapping page, we only need to make one change, and that is to retrieve mail, or to populate the ZSLogin username with the mail attribute from the directory. And so I will go in here and select mail. And remove UID. So complete that. So now username is mapped directly to mail. And we can ignore the rest of that configuration. All right, so that's everything. So the next couple of steps are to set this channel as active and then set the connection as enabled. Prior to doing that, I'm going to bring up, this is the provisioner login PingFederate. And so this will tell us when provisioning events occur. Again, I have it configured to run every 20 seconds, so they run pretty quickly. So I'm setting the channel to active, clicking done, and the last step of the SP connection is this activation and summary tab. We're going to enable the connection and click save, and that should be it. So there's a bit more logging this time around, but so far no provisioning has happened. That'll happen here in the next cycle. All right, so provisioning is occurring. A user was created. So if I refresh this tab now, we should see, yep, here's user.3 was added. Likewise, under user groups, we have a ZSLogin users group, which is perfect. All right, just to show one more provisioning event before we kind of wrap things up, I will add user.4 as another user to that group. And I did that just before the provisioner ran, so it just caught it. You can see that right here. So successfully created the user. Again, I should be able to refresh this page. See user.4. Perfect. So the last thing I want to show is that a user can SSO into ZSLogin. So bringing up a new browser here, my that username just happens to be cached from my prior run through this. So ZSLogin just redirected me over to PingFederate. This is the PingFederate server. I'm going to log in as user.3 at PingFederate. And you'll see I'll come back to ZSLogin and land on the ZSLogin SSO dashboard. This particular user doesn't have any administrative permissions yet, So all they just see is the Trust Portal icon, but ultimately this demonstrated the SSO integration with PingFederate. And that's everything I wanted to show. Thank you, everybody. Again, if you have any questions, my name is Eric Vazinen. Feel free to reach out.